Hello and welcome to Praxis, the monthly series of debates and discussions relating to international development issues hosted by the World Bank in Sydney. My name's Ian Gerard, and as ever I'd like to extend a special welcome to everyone watching at home on television or over the internet or listening on radio across the Asia Pacific. Today, in addition to our audience here in Sydney, we are again joined live by participants in Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste, and we look forward to hearing their questions and their thoughts a little later. This month's topic is climate change, and on the panel to discuss this issue are Robert Hill, former Federal Environment Minister and ex-Australian Ambassador to the UN and current Adjunct Professor of Sustainability at the University of Sydney's United States Studies Centre. In the centre we have Brian Dawson, Climate Change and Energy Advisor for the Australian Agency for International Development, AusAID, and Charles Feinstein, the World Bank's Sustainable Development Leader for Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea and the Pacific. This is the second Praxis discussion to centre on climate change, and it's taking place, appropriately enough, 2 days after the International Day of Climate Action. Earlier this year, we heard first-hand accounts of how places like Kiribati are being affected year-round by global warming. Our audience in Papua New Guinea know all about this. The PNG Prime Minister, Sir Michael Somare, has put it, "The islands are sinking. It is something the international community really needs to seriously look at." As has often been mentioned, developed nations need to lead by example on this issue. Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd has called climate change the great moral and economic challenge of our time. However, a recent article in the Sydney Morning Herald by political editor Peter Harcher effectively accused Mr Rudd of putting politics ahead of pressing his case for success on climate change, which, in Mr Rudd's own words, is vital for the future of our planet, the future of our economy, and the future of the peoples of the world. Worryingly, though, a Lowy Institute poll has revealed that the percentage of Australians who believe climate change is a threat to Australia's vital interests has declined from 68% in 2006 to 52% today. Those figures are replicated in the US, where polls show only 57% of Americans now believe in global warming, down from 77% 3 years ago. And if the people in developed countries aren't sold on the idea, what chance is there of reaching the stated goal of an ambitious global agreement incorporating all the countries of the world when COP15 begins 6 weeks from today? Already, there is talk of mistrust and suspicion regarding any potential deal, with African nations reportedly considering walking away from the negotiations. At Cairns in August, the leaders of the smaller island states again called for developed country emissions to average reductions of 45% below 1990 levels by 2020. Australia is currently committed to a 4 to 24% reduction. According to Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change findings and research modelling commissioned by the Australian and UK governments, even if the latter target is achieved, up to 20 to 50% of plant and animal species are still at risk of extinction. Up to 170 million people will still be affected by coastal flooding each year. 1 to 2 billion people will still face growing water shortages, and up to 150 to 550 million people will still be at risk of hunger. They're sobering statistics, but the onus cannot solely be on the developed world. Ivo de Boer, head of the Secretariat of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, believes that while industrialised countries have to lead, developing countries also have to come on board, suggesting they commit to a relative greenhouse gas reduction target of 15% below business as usual by 2020. It's time now to hear from our panellists, and once they have had their say, I shall invite questions from the audience. Our first panellist is Robert Hill. Robert is Adjunct Professor of Sustainability at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. He was Australian Ambassador to the United Nations from 2006 to 2009, and in July of this year, he was appointed Chairman of the Australian Carbon Trust by Kevin Rudd. Robert was a member of the Australian Senate from 1981 to 2006, representing South Australia. He was educated at the University of Adelaide and the London School of Economics, where he gained a master's degree in law. He was leader of the government in the Senate from March 1996 until leaving Parliament in January 2006, and as Minister for the Environment from 1996 to 1998, he led the Australian team at the Kyoto climate change talks. He has also held the heritage and defence portfolios. Robert.
Well, thank you. To talk about climate change in 7 minutes cover the field, but with a bias naturally towards the consequences and opportunities for the developing world is not it's not easy. I guess if I try to put it in perspective, you talked about COP15. It was 1992 the convention was agreed, which is not a long time ago in some ways. And when I look back and reflect on what's been achieved since, there has been a transformation in attitudes, and more importantly, perhaps related to that, there's been a huge growth in capacity to at least commence the process of restructuring towards less carbon-intense economies. It's an enormous challenge for the international community because since the Industrial Revolution, we've basically built our wealth on burning fossil fuels. And particularly difficult for a country such as Australia, which is so heavily dependent on exploitation of natural resources, to transform that economy in a way that is going to be much less carbon intense is expensive, difficult in practice, and requires a considerable mindset. But yet, as I said, we now have, we'll just take a country like China, for example. A very large proportion of its stimulus money was to be spent on green production, on renewable energy, on energy efficiency programs. That would never have happened 10 years ago. To have the United States even debating a cap and trade bill on climate change would never have occurred 10 years ago. So here we are. The first big judgment day, I guess, was really 1997, the convention 92. 1997, we had the Kyoto Protocol, in which developed countries agreed to legally binding reduction targets. Hardly any of them are on target, which is worrying. Australia is, but it's only because we managed to retard, in effect, stop land clearing in Australia. So it was a one-off benefit. It's not going to flow on. And the next big challenge after Kyoto was really intended to be the Copenhagen meeting this year, because that meeting was not only going to debate what should be the targets for the future for developed countries, but also what sort of commitments the developing world should play. In relation to the developing world, for the small developing countries, their emissions are irrelevant in the big picture, but they do suffer the consequences in the same way as everyone else, and in some ways they suffer the consequences more dramatically because they don't have the capacity to adapt, they don't have the financial strength to adapt in the way that some do. So they suffer as much, if not more, than the big emitters, but they have less capacity to do anything about it themselves. So the issue for the developing world is what can come out of Copenhagen that can give them a better chance for the future. The first thing they would want, of course, is a reduction of emissions from the major emitters, principally the developed world, but becoming more important, the major developing country emitters as well, Brazil, China, India, Russia, etc. Secondly, they'd want a program or a funding base for adaptation. And I think my colleague will speak a bit more about that. And thirdly, they may also want some support in reducing their own emissions, but it's not going to be really consequential in the global picture. So it's a hugely complex negotiation because in some ways it's like the GATT but with extra layers added on. The world has never tried to negotiate anything as complex as this before, and as I said, in really a very short period of time. And it takes not only a transformation of attitude, but it takes the technical capacity as well. And a lot of this debate is really about what are the technologies that will enable major economies to change, and how can we transfer those economies in an equitable way, and who's going to pay the cost of transferring those, and if a fund is going to be set up, who's going to administer that fund, which brings us back to the World Bank and their interests. So perhaps if I leave it there as just an introduction, an attempt to add an overview, of the picture, and we'll take it from questions.
Absolutely, that's a great idea. We'll obviously hear more from Robert at question time later on. Now it's time to hear from Brian Dawson. Brian is AusAID's Climate Change and Energy Advisor and author of The Complete Guide to Climate Change, which was published this year. Before joining AusAID, he was based in New York as Climate Change Advisor for the United Nations Development Programme, and he has 20 years' experience in the climate change field. Brian.
Thanks, Ian. Well, firstly, what I want to say today is mainly keep comments to the development perspective and looking what climate change means for developing countries in our region, but also just to add a bit of context about climate change. And I certainly won't give you a lecture on climate change science, that's not the intention. But one thing that's clear, and I think it's become much more clear, particularly in the last 6 to 12 months, is the gravity of the situation that we face has started to surface. And I think, as Robert said, over the last decade, the rate at which the world's come up to speed on climate change has been quite remarkable. And unfortunately, Ian gave some statistics just before about current awareness and whether climate change is an issue. I found those pretty disturbing. But in a general sense, I think climate change has become much more into the mainstream in terms of media and also the perception of people, and a lot of people are talking about it. Now, even if we're successful at Copenhagen and there are actually significant reductions committed to, one thing is for sure, we're still committed to a substantial adaptation requirement. So just the way the system works, to move through the system, really you've got to look at sort of 40 to 50 years lead time for the full impacts of what we've done already to feel themselves in the system. So we're actually going to face a pretty significant challenge, even if we were able to stabilise concentrations today. And that is, as Robert also said, an extremely complex and difficult task. Hopefully at some stage in the next 20 or 30 years we can start to reduce concentrations, but that remains to be seen. So having said that, and having said that adaptation's a reality, what is it that we can actually do, and what do we know and what we don't know? Well, we generally know that some of the impacts of climate change are going to be felt most severely on biodiversity. And in my view, I think that's probably the single largest immediate impact that people are not aware of, is the implications for the world's biodiversity. The second thing is the water and food security issues. Now, those three issues, I think, are the principal issues facing the developing world, and also to a large extent the developed world as well. So what we don't know is actually the severity and timing of these issues. And the science is still at the very early days. We've made substantial progress in the last decade on the science front, or in the last 20 years. And every few weeks something new comes out, and a new sort of insight into what's happening. One thing that has been quite evident is that we've generally underestimated by a significant extent the actual rate at which these impacts are starting to manifest themselves. Now, it's hard to, because there's so many conflicting cycles in the system, it's hard to work out exactly what is going to occur, what can slow down, what can speed up. But generally, things overall look much worse than they are getting better for most of the countries in the world. So given that, what do we actually do? How do we move forward? In the Pacific debate, and I think a lot of the time I'll spend in the remainder of my talk is looking at our neighbouring countries. In the Pacific situation, I think, the sort of general level of discussion has been quite poorly informed in many respects. Sea level rise, migration, those sort of issues are extremely serious, and in the longer term will be diabolical for some countries. However, I think that brushes over some of the short-term issues on food security and water security, but more particularly because of the importance of fisheries have to the lifestyles of people in the Pacific. This is a really, really sensitive area, and one where I think the Pacific will have to have a major adaptation response. The problem is we don't really know with any accuracy the timing and extent of these impacts. If you go to SBC, which is running the fisheries program, and actually ask them, well, which fish are going where, what's going to happen on coastal fisheries, reef fisheries, to the tuna stocks, got broad understanding about temperature sensitivity, changes in currents, but really we don't know. So one is we have to substantially increase our scientific information based on fisheries and on what crops are suitable, sort of water resources. Some countries will get wetter, some countries will get drier. If you move across to Indonesia, it's a very different set of circumstances. They have a lot of similarities with the Pacific Island countries, but they also face a lot of issues associated with forest resources and their fisheries and their water base, particularly in the eastern part of Indonesia and East Timor. They face potentially 20 to 30% reductions in water availability over the next 30 to 40 years. Serious implications for the development paradigm they adopt. And then moving across to South Asia, which is the last area where AusAID has increasing its engagement, or the Mekong in South Asia. These two river systems, like for example the Ganges river system, 600 million people depend on that for their livelihoods. That's going to suffer some very serious changes in its water availability over the coming years, coupled with increasing water use, increased urbanisation, increased population, and the whole demands about cross-border equity issues and flows of migrants and conflicts. If you add that together, the cocktail there doesn't look particularly promising. So major issue on transboundary water sharing. So that's just some of the context. I think in terms of advice on adaptation, if you go out into a lot of these countries, everyone's aware of climate change. People are aware that there's going to be large flows of finance coming for adaptation, but they don't really have a full grip on what adaptation actually means for them in an economic development context. If you go to the water department or you go to the agricultural department, they've heard about it, but really they're not what I'd call mainstream engaged. Environment departments generally are, but they're not the ones that often make the economy tick. So bringing up the understanding within these systems of what climate change hold for their programs and their policies, and what they can actually do to reduce the risks of climate change is probably the biggest short-term objective. So in terms of how do we get information to decision makers, the Australian government has, through various initiatives of this government and previous governments, investing quite a large sum of money in building up the knowledge base, trying to work out what's happening in fisheries and with sea level rise and coastal erosion. It takes time. The data's pretty sketchy, and we've got a lot of data collection analysis to do. But the key issue, and just to finish off, where I think the big approach on adaptation is adopting a risk management approach, and wouldn't be going out building seawalls just at the moment, because that's maladaptation, and there's such a finite amount of resources that need to be spread around to high priority development issues. We've got to be very careful that we invest, if it's going to be large-scale investment, to invest in areas that actually make sense in the short to medium term in adaptation. The sea level rise, as I mentioned, will be a big issue, but that's probably more 30, 40, 50 years away. Some of the short-term issues on fishery and water and agriculture we really need to start moving on. And the last point is on extreme weather events, and a lot of the coastal communities around the Asia-Pacific region are going to be increasingly subject to more intense and possibly more frequent cyclones. The region has yet to become what I'd call disaster risk management framework adopted. I mean, what needs to be done is to invest much more in limiting the repercussions of these events rather than mopping up after they occur. So I think one of the short-term adaptation responses we need to focus on in the region is actually really improving the existing situation in terms of reducing risk, and just covering off the adaptation deficits already there in terms of poverty reduction, basic sanitation, basic water services, and basic nutrition and health. They're the key principles. So I'm sure there's going to be questions asked about various aspects, but the key thing is don't panic. I mean, climate change is not going to go away, and we're going to have, over the next 50 years or so, a very large task ahead of us. Thanks.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Brian. Finally, I'd like to introduce Charles Feinstein. Chaz is the World Bank's Sustainable Development Leader for Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea and the Pacific, having previously been Sector Manager for Energy Operations in the Europe and Central Asia region. These roles build on Chaz's earlier work as a renewable energy specialist and his role as co-author of the World Bank's Environmental Strategy for the Energy Sector paper, Fuel for Thought. Through the 1990s, Chaz was team leader for climate change in the World Bank's Environment Department, managing the development of the World Bank Global Environment Facility Climate Change Project Portfolio and advising on World Bank policies related to climate change. Chaz has also been instrumental in fostering new public-private partnerships for climate change mitigation, such as the early practical demonstration of market-based systems for greenhouse emissions abatement, which culminated in the launch of the groundbreaking $180 million prototype carbon fund. Chaz.
Thank you, Ian. I have to admit, I get a bit nervous when I'm asked to come to a forum like this and talk about climate change. And it's not because I'm such a timid fellow or camera shy. It's more that the breadth of the topic is intimidating. And particularly, I think there's a lot of confusion out there, not practiced by this panel, between mitigation on one hand and adaptation on the other. And to me, these are very different challenges, and while they're interrelated, they're really two different lines of business. Mitigation is about removing, or at least trying to lessen the threat of climate change, essentially by reducing or abating emission of greenhouse gases. As I'll say later, that's relevant to the Pacific Islands, but in a different context, for example, of a China or United States. And then, of course, as particularly Brian eloquently spoke, there's the threat of climate change, the vulnerability of Pacific states, and the impact. So let me start by saying a few words on the mitigation or abatement side. I think from a global perspective, that's primarily an energy problem. I think if you look, first off, at just the raw statistics, energy use is responsible for about 3/4 of all the carbon dioxide emissions on the planet. Why is carbon dioxide so significant? Well, there are other greenhouse gases out there. For example, methane gas, which comes from waste dumps or animal emissions, for example. But methane has an atmospheric lifetime of only about 15 years. So we have time to figure out how to solve that problem. And when we solve it, that threat will dissipate. CO2, once we put it in the atmosphere, has an effective life of about 150 years. So it's very important to get a handle on the energy problem. Now, as I think some of the previous speakers have hinted, for the Pacific states, energy use is just a fraction, really, of total, accounts for total greenhouse gas emissions. For example, a colleague of mine worked out that the Pacific states' total greenhouse gas emissions from energy are about 0.75% of the greenhouse emissions of Australia. Now, when you consider the Pacific harbors perhaps about 8 million people, in Australia about 2.5 times that, you get a handle that many people in the Pacific just don't have access to modern energy. They're producing very low levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And the real development challenge really is to consume more energy, not less. I like to frame the whole challenge of greenhouse gas mitigation in the Pacific as not an environmental issue, but an economic issue. In other words, Pacific states most of them are very dependent on energy imports. East Timor would be probably an exception. Papua New Guinea is heading towards development of its gas resources in a large-scale way, could develop some sort of energy independence. But for most Pacific states, they're virtually 100% import dependent, which means they're extremely vulnerable to the price shocks of the global oil market. And we've seen petroleum go from $147 a barrel, dropping all the way to the low 30s, and it's now pushing $80 a barrel. $80 a barrel is historically a very high level of price, and it's having negative impacts today on the macroeconomy and the economic viability of our Pacific Island countries. And so therefore, it behooves the Pacific states to develop some sort of resilience against future fluctuations in the oil import regime. And climate change gives them a great excuse, if you will, and a means. Under climate change, well, that has motivated large-scale flows of new and concessional resources. You mentioned my introduction, the Global Environment Facility. Also, at the World Bank, we have about a $3 billion facility called the Climate Investment Fund, also used to stimulate development of new technologies and their transference to developing countries. We have, under Kyoto, the Clean Development Mechanism, and I think in any future climate deal, there's likely to be some other kind of carbon trading regime. These are all quite large resource flows which can be tapped and leveraged by developing countries to help them out in terms of clean energy and reduce the vulnerability of their energy economies. So for example, for the Pacific states, they don't have a hope of extending grid lines to much of their populations, but renewable energy solutions like distributed solar energy can provide that means. And if countries in our client base can get paid for that, so much the better. Equally, if they can develop hydropower, for example, a country like Papua New Guinea has got enormous hydropower reserves, that insulates them against the future shock of global oil market movements. So for me, and I think for many of us in the World Bank, particularly working on more the mitigation side, we see climate change as not really a challenge of Pacific states to reduce their emissions, but how can they in effect benefit from the concern and the large-scale financial flows that are going to result. Just a couple of words about vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation in the Pacific. An observation I could make is we oftentimes fail to exploit the linkages between disaster risk reduction on one hand and long-run climate change adaptation on the other. I could tell you a story of being in front of a development minister in the Caribbean about 10 years ago. And he asked me, well, what do you think we should do about climate change here, about adaptation? And I said, well, we've done some early studies, and it seems like some of your seawalls that you've got against storm surge, if you rebuild them or if you build them afresh, they'll have to be either augmented or built at a higher level. Perhaps some of your agricultural plots will have to be located more inland to prevent against saltwater intrusion. Or perhaps some of the roadways will have to be moved a little bit to higher ground, again, to prevent against storm surge. And he looked at me and he says, yes, that's right, but I had a guy here last week talking about disaster management. He told me exactly the same thing. And it's true that there is this overlap, that in the process of hardening infrastructure, hardening societies really, against the long-run effects of climate change, you will do a lot to improve their short-run resilience against so-called natural disasters, and vice versa. And I think we do our Pacific clients a disservice if we go in and treat these as entirely separate agendas, because they have only very limited institutional and human capacity to deal with a very broad range of threats, ranging from cyclones and earthquakes, storm surge floods, all the way to the changes in climate regimes and sea level rise. And if we can somehow harmonize or rationalize our dialogue and our assistance, I think the effectiveness of what we do will be amplified.
I'd like to just pick up on some of the points you were making there, Chaz. Are we going to reach a point soon where mitigation efforts are going to have to take a backseat to adaptation efforts? And is the role of COP15 important, crucial even in that time frame, in that point?
Well, I don't know if mitigations will take a back seat to adaptation efforts. But let me put it this way. I think there is a little bit of unrealism in the debate, and this statement is not going to make me popular with perhaps the audience or people who are organizing even last weekend's event centered around 350 parts per million. I do not think it's possible, this is my personal opinion, not the World Bank's, I do not think it's economically possible, politically possible, to stabilize the global atmosphere at 350 parts per million. To me, that is already, as we say, it's something we're seeing already in the rearview mirror. There is so much inertia, political inertia, economic inertia, physical inertia around energy systems that I cannot see how the big battleship can turn that quickly to reduce emissions so quickly that we can stabilize there. Now, does that mean that we should give up on emissions reductions? No way. I mean, I think we have a huge challenge to stabilize at 450 parts per million, which seems to be the kind of the emerging target that many delegations, for example, that will be in Copenhagen will have in their radar. I think it will be even a huge challenge to stabilize at 550 parts per million. And I guess the flip side of that is maybe the answer to your question. If it's going to be so hard to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at levels that scientists tell us will prevent significant damage, then that says we ought to get busy working on to make our infrastructure, our agriculture, our human settlements more resistant to the future changes that are going to come.
Great, thank you for that. We've got a question from Timor-Leste, which I'll ask before another question from Sydney. This is for you, Brian, and it comes from James Hardman of National Disaster Management. He says, AusAID is the biggest donor in Timor-Leste and also PNG, and the country has an extremely variable climate. how do you think AusAID should change their approach in Timor-Leste to give due attention to the risks of climate change, given that there is very limited attention, at least visible attention?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's not just confined to Timor. I think you need to consider climate change in a development context across all aid agencies around the world. A lot of the aid agencies, from the traditional form of what aid's been delivered, are grappling with what does this mean for us. In Timor itself, we're only just in the process of starting to look at what can be done in the country and gearing some of the existing water and agricultural programs to get a climate change lens on them. It takes a bit of time to do that. One, you've got the already inertia in most bureaucratic systems. It takes a while to change, but we're making good progress there. But more importantly, the receptivity of the government itself and their appreciation of whether or not these are key issues. So it's a two-edged sword, and I think progress is being made. East Timor is actually a very vulnerable country, and most of the aid we develop in the future or deliver in the future needs to have a climate change lens, not only in terms of how they develop their energy economy, but also in terms of their water policy, food policy, disaster risk reduction. It's across all sectors. So it's a big task, but I think in the next 6 months you'll see quite a bit happening in that space.
Lovely. Thank you. Question from the front here.
Margaret Duckett, I'm Chief Executive Officer of a development agency, Australian Foundation for Peoples of Asia and the Pacific. A number of us had a meeting with AusAID last week talking about the timelines for money and development NGOs with AusAID, World Bank, the other things, because we're in a quandary. To do very good project design, to scale up everything, it's usually a 7 or 8 year timeline. And most of us don't think we have that when we're talking about climate change. And so we were talking about the challenges for the government funds, the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, in how do you look at your processes in ways where you're still going to get good development outcomes, but move to the timelines that we really need to be working on if we are to actually properly mitigate at one hand, adapt at the other, and particularly for so vulnerable countries like the Pacific Island states.
Is that for Brian, that question?
It's mainly for Brian, but it's also the World Bank I see having a role as well.
Brian, please.
Oh, well, no doubt whatsoever about what you say. I mean, it's quite clear, as I think going on from what I said in the last comments, is that we recognise that we need to change the systems. We need to get a much bigger focus on climate change, or at least understand the repercussions climate change has for existing aid policies and programs and the way we engage not only at the community level but at the national level. To be frank, largely a political process. It's very difficult for people at what the normal bureaucrat level to make big decisions on this, but I think that recognition's quite clear, and at the meeting last week you would have got some indication from Robin about that's the situation. We recognise it and we'll have to address it as quickly as we possibly can, but it definitely needs to change.
Charles, quick comment on that.
Margaret, let me react to your original thesis that you may not have 7 or 8 years to plan a development project. Take your time. Okay, I mean, doing good development projects does take time. And I think the essence of, if you're talking about resilience of Pacific societies against climate change, I think fundamentally it's a question of smart development, of developing in a way where some of the extra costs of building resiliency are recognized very early on, and so that decisions are taken, for example, in infrastructure, where the marginal costs of accommodating or reacting to those future long-run climate changes can be minimized. A great example is when you build a port. If you know today, with some probabilistic assessment, that 50 years from now that port has to be an extra meter, that jetty or quay has to be 1 meter taller, deeper, then you can accommodate that fairly easily. If you were to wait 20 or 30 or 50 years when sea level rises upon you and then have to re-engineer your port, it's going to be very expensive. So getting it right the first time is important. I think there's no substitute, frankly, for wealth and development in terms of making societies more resistant and better able to manage the buffeting that future climate change is going to impose upon them. And as an extreme example, I remember about 20 years ago when climate change was first recognized as a threat, a very prominent U.S. economist said, well, really, to a first approximation, climate change won't really do much to the United States economy. Well, how do you figure? Well, 97% of all value added in the United States occurs indoors, in offices and factories, whatever. So he figured out if there's going to be, say, a 2-degree temperature rise, you would have to turn the air conditioning up by another 2 degrees, and that would result in such and such energy use. Well, that's an extreme example, but the ability to get wealthier and have the resources to spend on climate change adaptation is very important.
Lovely, thank you. Robert, I'd like to ask you a question with your ex-ambassador's hat on, and it's simply this. Do you think that a workable agreement can be reached and will be reached at COP15?
I don't think a treaty language agreement will be reached, no. Okay. The most recent hopes coming from people like De Boer that you mentioned were that there will be a framework, some sort of framework agreement, perhaps an agreed timetable to reach a treaty agreement, and some specific agreements on subsidiary issues that can have early implementation stages attached to them. And I think even that would be a pretty big ask, but if that could be achieved, I would regard it as a successful outcome. You know, it's really only been a couple of years since Bali. The economic complexity, there's so many issues. We haven't talked about the forestry issues and the red issues, which are very challenging in themselves and relevant to some of the Pacific countries, PNG, the Solomons, Timor. So that's what I'm looking for. If there can be some agreement on targets, if there can be an ongoing commitment to continue with the negotiations, but with some subsidiary agreements on issues where there is a consensus, and we've got to remember this could be by consensus, which makes it even harder. 192 countries by consensus on something that affects them economically. It's very difficult. And get some of those areas where there is agreement underway, so you start getting the practical benefits, which gives confidence to continue the process on the harder issues, then I think that would be a pretty good outcome.
And staying on the COP15 theme and staying with you, Robert, this is a question from David Ephraim of Climate Change Project, an NGO in PNG. And he says, the outcome of COP15 and the concerns of implications on state and security, given the growing divide on geopolitical developments. How does this affect the state decisions and the progress of Copenhagen outcomes?
Well, if that means do economic consequences for all have to be taken into account? Yes, that's right. And the cost of abatement to different economies varies greatly. And the opportunity cost to different economies varies greatly. If we're talking about PNG, for example, I just mentioned forests. PNG has got a real opportunity through this negotiation to end up with a formula that will allow them to conserve forests and make money out of it as well, and maybe to rehabilitate forests and make money out of it as well. And together with the other sort of development opportunities that come out of the broader negotiation for a country such as PNG, it's not all a downside. But it is going to be very hard to reach the agreement that decides who's going to pay for what, in what time frame, and how it's going to be administered.
Yeah, which is one of the points that a number of the African nations have been making of late, of course.
African nations had recent meetings in which they are really starting to, well, firstly they're starting to group together and negotiate as a group, which is unusual in climate change negotiations. But secondly, they said they're not going to be taken for a ride. They don't want a half agreement, and I think it's a good point. But there are great opportunities for African nations. Again, if you look at a place like the DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, the opportunity to conserve its forests, the opportunity to develop its enormous hydro potential, which it's already doing with the World Bank, but it can get a new income source through this process, and in other ways develop its economy, are really quite tremendous if it's done properly. And that's, I think, what they're saying. They're not going to be sold short.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we get another question from Sydney, please? Yes, in the second row.
Thank you very much. Christian Nielsen from Live and Learn in Melbourne. I returned from Solomon Islands 2 weeks ago, and the problems that Brian mentioned about food security and loss of fisheries, they are very real. Communities, as we sit here today, are feeling these problems from climate change. A lot of money will be made available to the World Bank to try to combat these problems. AusAID has already committed $150 million for the Pacific in adaptation. A large portion of that money will go to the World Bank for implementation. How will the World Bank ensure that the grassroots, the communities in rural areas can be reached and really benefit from all this climate change funding? How will you work with NGOs? How will you work with the community groups? Do you have the mechanisms within the bank to do so? Or if not, how are you going to position yourself to have the reach to the ground?
Look, I can't promise exactly how we're going to do business in the Solomon Islands. We've only recently reached agreement with that government about the outlines of an adaptation program, initially funded through the Global Environment Facility. But if AusAID funding is also available, that would be very welcome. But I can point to a very relevant example precisely along the lines that you were questioning, and that is in Samoa. Very relevant because they've just had a natural disaster. Going back about 8-10 years ago, we started a program called Samoa Infrastructure Asset Management. It's now in its second phase. We're into about the second year of the repeater project. Originally, this was a project designed basically to help the Samoans get a handle on their infrastructure assets, to catalog them, to put them on a maintenance schedule, to understand what the budget processes would be to maintain them and replace them eventually. And in the course of doing that, we, with both NGOs and the traditional community leadership, the Matai system, we had an intensive dialogue with villages, and we discovered that villagers have a catalog in their head of disaster vulnerability. They can remember back generations about when such and such storm hit, how high the water came up, or which assets were damaged during the last hurricane or cyclone. And so we added a component to that project on disaster management and climate proofing. And with the help of some very sharp New Zealand consultants who were not only good engineers but were very well versed in community dialogue, each community produced, with the consultants' help, what's called a community infrastructure mapping. So the roads, the clinics, the telecommunications, the power lines, they were all mapped out for the community, and points of specific vulnerability were mapped out, and recommendations, again, if this was going to be replaced or rebuilt, what would you do different? And that's actually also not only a map that's being used right now in the aftermath of the tsunami as to how the southeast coast of Samoa is going to be rebuilt. There's a lot of information there that's very useful, as I mentioned before, about how societies, in this case Samoa, can protect themselves against long-run climate change. So there are successful models out there of development institutions working with governments and communities to tap this kind of knowledge and to respond to community-level needs.
Great, thanks, Charles. Brian, another question for you from Timor. This is from Joanna de Mesquita Lima from the UNDP Poverty Reduction and Environmental Unit. She asks, what do you see as the most effective role for community-based adaptation activities? And she goes on to say, to be effective, adaptation has to be implemented at all levels, from policy to the local level, it would be interesting to learn how AusAID looks at the effective role of community initiatives. That's
a good question. Well, firstly, I think one of the key elements that underpins that question is that the adaptation response varies considerably depending on who you are, where you're located. So it's a very localised issue. And there's national programs, regional programs, provincial programs, community-based programs. They all have a role to play. So it's a matter of how do you engage horizontally and vertically in this process. With the community-based approach, often they're much more aware, as Chaz was just mentioning, about their circumstances, what's vulnerable, where the biggest weaknesses are. And we have just funded, and East Timor, as soon as they become a signatory to the GEF, or eligible under GEF 5, will actually have access to the Small Grants Program. The Australian Government is actually funding a $6 million program on small grants to actually look at getting adaptation responses at the community level. I think that's one mechanism of doing it. I think another one is actually active engagement with the NGO community, and particularly in multi-sector programs, not just looking at environmental issues, but there's already quite a bit of work undergoing on the disaster risk reduction, on community education, water facilities, particularly water and sanitation. They're very important aspects to develop in a community sense to build up their resilience and adaptability as well. So I think AusAID and other aid agencies already operate quite well at that front, but the climate change dimension is a little bit different. And I think over the next few years you'll see these community engagement programs and a lot of the NGO community as well much more climate savvy. So I think, in terms of, you can't really put a priority on any particular issue. It depends on their localised area. But I think the NGO community in particular, the local NGOs, have made enormous progress and are well aware of the issues. So I'm not quite sure whether it fully answers her question, but I think the key message is that at all levels we'll have to work, and the community-based approach will be absolutely essential to coping strategies. And
are education initiatives required as well?
Absolutely. I mean, that's across the board. Even in developed countries, education initiatives are required. People's understanding of what climate change is and how it manifests themselves is still pretty poor in a lot of areas, even for well-educated people. And I think we all are learning every day about what are the priorities, how to best tackle them. I think if we're ever going to really address climate change as a global civilisation, really it needs to start from kindergarten. And until we get that, we're really going to be struggling to incorporate enough political force to actually adjust to this issue.
Absolutely. Can we get another question from Sydney, please, in the third row?
Hi, I'm Gemma Pepper from National Arts and Culture Alliance. This is a question predominantly for Brian and Chaz. If water and food security is one of the more immediate threats that's being posed, should the mitigation response include discussion about the management of population growth for those countries that will experience that firsthand?
Brian, do you want to fill that first?
I'll go first. A very sensitive issue, of course. One of the things that sort of has underpinned a lot of the discussions in the last 20 years in the international process is a very heavy focus on development, on carbon, on mitigation, on climate change and economic growth, and a very little amount of attention paid to population. But as any basic person understanding what drives global emissions, the two most important things is income per capita, and the second most important is actual numbers of people. So you can't address the climate change situation without addressing population, because the two are involved. However, having said that, an extra 20 million people living in Bangladesh is only the same as 2 years of immigration for Australia. So it's the footprint of each of these individuals that's important as well. If we can put in place a process of developing low carbon growth models or economic development models where we have the emphasis on a minimum impact of each individual, it means you can actually still have population, have increasing living standards, and also address the climate issue. However, a lot of work needs to be done there. So I think there's no way at all you could ever address climate change without also considering what forces population increases will actually have on your ability to achieve those targets or objectives.
I would have a little add. I would certainly echo what Brian say. I mean, it really depends on the context. If you mean a Pacific context, frankly, I'm not going to worry whether the population of Kiribati is 100,000 or 150,000 in terms of impact on global emissions and the probability of future climate change. I would be very worried, on the other hand, whether there's 100,000 people at risk in Kiribati or 150,000 people at risk. And possibly, for a country that vulnerable, a truly long-run adaptation strategy will probably involve some relocation of people. And so that populations and population size would be a factor that you'd have to keep in mind.
Another question from Sydney, please. Yeah, Kirk.
Kirk Huffman, I'm the honorary curator of the Vanuatu Culture Centre. I'm with the museum in Tahiti and the Australian Museum here, the Clay Museum at Sydney University, and a few other places. I've had 35 years of experience with remote traditional communities in eastern Melanesia, particularly Vanuatu. Now, there are communities out there that refuse money. Money may not be the right answer to things. You have to think also outside the box. Give support for traditional ways to do things without money. Money may be the problem rather than the answer. But there's another thing that I'd like to leap in on, and it's something that you brought up, Chas. With Kiribati and Tuvalu, they're going to go. They'll have to move eventually. It's really sad. But as there's a general feeling amongst Pacific Islanders that all the climate change stuff is what we call in Pidgin English, fault below white man, the white man's fault. And they're right. They're not wrong. It's the white man's fault. The white man should pay for relocation. The white man's got to pay for everything else. Just send the bill there. That's the attitude amongst some really remote traditional communities, and they're not wrong. If, for example, Kiribati and Tuvalu will eventually have to go, and they don't want to go. They don't all want to come to Australia or New Zealand or wherever. They'd prefer to stay where they are. But if they do have to go, can they remain as independent states wherever they go? And can they legally retain their rights over their vast sea areas so that the money made out of the fishing in those areas can go to them wherever they have to move? That's something to think about, seriously. Yeah. Sorry.
That's a very curly question. I don't know if there's an answer to that. Gentlemen, have any of you got a thought on that?
Well, I don't know if there's an answer to it, but Robert ventured that COP15 may not, probably won't result in a concrete wraparound agreement, and I agree with him. And I think there are two issues at stake. One is that if you even go back to the 1992 convention, it talks about the developed world taking the lead. Well, one could argue that at least parts of the developed world have not taken the lead in terms of demonstrable actions to date to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The other aspect, though, and this is also embedded in the Climate Change Convention, is that precisely the concept that you were talking about. I wouldn't call it compensation, but there is going to have to be a flow of resources from the developed to the developing world, both in terms of technology transfer, so that they can develop in a way maybe that doesn't exactly mimic the way we've developed in terms of carbon intensity, but also sensitively, is there going to be some sort of relief in terms of meeting the costs of adaptation? And I think that's the other sticking point right now in the negotiations as to why Copenhagen probably won't result, in my view, in a wraparound deal.
Great. Can we have another question? Time for another two quick questions from, one quick question, I've been told, from Sydney, please. Right at the front, please.
It's Vivian Savrimutu from the University of Western Sydney. Now, some 30 years ago, they were talking of, the talk was to reduce poverty, and they were talking of basic needs approach, whatever. They're still talking about it now because it's the first goal in the MDG, eradicating poverty. So how do you suppose that this new issue, climate change, can have a quick impact, whatever you do? I mean, whatever program that you bring up or negotiate with the governments. I read somewhere in one of the World Bank reports that much of the aid that goes into these countries, most of it doesn't reach the, it doesn't reach the rural areas. Most of the projects are for either urban or peri-urban areas. So how are you going to deal with that in terms of the rural areas?
Chas, quick answer, please.
Boy, you've opened up a whole can of worms, haven't you? First, as a counterpoint, I would say that in terms of patterns of development and industrialization, what happens in urban areas in much of the developing world is going to really determine the future of the planet and the fate of the planet under climate change. If you look at patterns of urbanization, of energy use, of energy intensity, it's all happening in urban areas. So I'm not sure, I don't want to sound difficult, but I'm not so sure that climate change is primarily a rural challenge. And I think people in urban areas are going to be also vulnerable, perhaps equally vulnerable to rural dwellers to the coming changes brought on by climate change.
Thank you, Chaz. Thank you, gentlemen, as well. That's all we have time for today, so it just remains for me to formally thank Robert Hill, Brian Dawson and Charles Feinstein. Thank you for joining us in Sydney and also in Dili and Port Moresby. You can watch this Praxis at www.worldbank.org/PI, and Praxis will return again next month. In the meantime, thank you very much.